Hey guys, Matt from Mankind here. Our story's going to start in 1961 when JFK would address Congress about moon missions.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
1962.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This would get America thinking. It would also set in motion the Apollo missions, little by little giving more space propaganda to further advance the moon missions. They would deceive the world and make loads of money. These deceivers would orchestrate a sci-fi movie and call it a documentary. Apollo 11 would go on to cost a total of $25 billion in 1973. This would be around $135 billion today. This moon mission would set up many more money-making projects for NASA, give credit to pseudoscience, and made heroes out of villains. Join me as I investigate the technique and technology involved in the deception known as Apollo 11. And if you haven't seen my first video, part 1, please check it out.
In the summer of 1961, as the United States embarked on its great space adventure, one question above all others remained unresolved. What kind of spacecraft would take a man to the moon and bring him back alive?
The United States had a total of 15 minutes of spaceflight experience, 5 minutes outside the Earth's atmosphere, and now we were committed to go to the moon. We knew nothing about the moon. No unmanned spacecraft had landed there or even taken decent pictures of it. It was very vague how we would even get to the moon, what would the vehicles look like, what kind of rocket we would need.
During the initial briefings, everybody assumed the way to the moon was to send one huge spaceship all the way there and all the way back. But at NASA, they already knew there was a problem.
It required landing a big, heavy, bulky spacecraft on the lunar surface. It required lifting an enormous amount of weight back off of the moon. One additional disadvantage was that it required a rocket that probably was going to be 50, 60, maybe 70 feet high. And it finally occurred to some of the engineers, how are these astronauts going to get out of this big vehicle and get down on the lunar surface?
As NASA puzzled over the problem, an obscure engineer called John Hobalt came up with a radical alternative. Instead of taking a single giant spaceship to the moon and back, why not build a second, lightweight craft that would shuttle between the moon and a mothership? It would be smaller, lighter, and much more maneuverable. There was only one massive drawback. To get back to Earth would require the lunar shuttle to rendezvous with the mothership in lunar orbit.
What scared everybody about it is you have to rendezvous and dock around the moon. You're 250,000 miles from Earth. And he's proposing this in 1961 when we had no spaceflight experience, and just rendezvousing and docking in Earth orbit concerned everybody.
Hobalt's idea would be kind of crazy. You'd have to 180 spin in the space environment and redock with the LM. Any mistake in this part would cause a catastrophe. You would have to then pull out the LM using the command service module, and this would continue your spaceflight around the moon somehow. Then you would have to undock and hope for the best as the LM sails towards the moon. From the PDF Enchanted Rendezvous, Hobart had a scheme that has a 50% chance of getting a man to the moon and a 1% chance of getting him back. It seems highly unlikely that the first time they would ever try this, everything would work. Clinton E. Brown, head of Langley Lunar Mission Steering Group on Trajectories and Guidance, said, "There was a reluctance to believe that the rendezvous maneuver was an easy thing. In fact, to a layman, if you were able to explain what you had to do to perform a rendezvous in space, he would say that sounds so difficult, we'll never be able to do it in this century." It's impossible to believe that this asymmetrical device popped off of the moon's surface, spun around in orbit, and linked up directly with the command service module the first time ever, with no practice, no nothing, the first time ever. There's just no way.
Every time he brought the idea up, he was shut down. Everybody said that he didn't know what he was talking about. It was very embarrassing because he is a very quiet, very reserved, reticent man, and he was very taken back by the hostility.
The opposition was led by NASA's foremost rocket expert, Wernher von Braun, who had always favored the big rocket approach and now told Hubble to cut the lunar rendezvous crap.
Wernher von Braun had a very strong ego, was very popular in the United States, very famous in the United States because of his appearance on television, and believed very strongly in the idea of taking a big rocket to the moon.
In desperation, Hobart finally wrote directly to NASA's top leadership.
In these letters, Dr. Hobart said, "I know that I'm stepping out of line here. I know I might even get fired because I'm writing this letter, but I think it's so important to bring this to your attention that I'm willing to risk my career in doing it."
He said something like, "I know I may be a pain in the neck and I shouldn't be writing this letter to you," and so on, "but I feel so strongly about this, I feel impelled to write you."
And he said in these letters to Dr. Siemens that the lunar orbit rendezvous idea was the only way to get us to the moon. Dr. Hobart didn't say, "I think it's one way," or he didn't say, "I think it's the best way." He said, "I think it's the only way."
It was rather strident in the way it was written, and my first reaction was, I'd like some way to get that son of a gun off my back.
But Siemens was sufficiently intrigued to recommend that Hobart's proposal should at least get a serious hearing. It was a turning point. At a meeting in June 1962, called to hammer out a solution, von Braun took everybody by surprise.
Everybody was getting together to again try and talk about what decision they were going to make on going to the moon.
The von Braun team gave a presentation, and when they finished, Werner stood up and he said, "I'm really proud of our group." He said, "That was a wonderful presentation. You considered everything very, very carefully, but I have to tell you that that's not what I'm going to recommend." I'm going to recommend that we go lunar orbit rendezvous.
It was such a surprise to everybody that even his own staff people several days later had a private meeting with him, and they said, "Why in the world did you say that? What led you to believe that? We were completely surprised that you decided to announce for lunar orbit rendezvous."
Belatedly, von Braun had recognized it was the only way. And in the fall of 1962, U.S. aircraft manufacturers competed to build what became known as the Lunar Excursion Module, or LEM. This unearthly device is a Grumman lunar module, the most specialized yet most broadly capable manned space vehicle ever built. In 1961, when he was a young engineer of 32, Thomas J. Kelly headed the design of that remarkable machine. But America's quest for the moon actually began 4 years earlier, on a fateful day in 1957.
I still remember when the Sputnik was launched, which kind of was a rude awakening for this country and for me personally about the space age.
Some found consolation in the shock, but Sputnik was a public relations disaster for the United States. Yet worse was to come. First, the Soviets sent a dog into orbit, then a man. By 1961, John F. Kennedy was president. For him, the worsening situation represented a direct political challenge.
We insisted that we should see the president. We felt it was an important issue, and we did see President Kennedy. And he was really not prepared to make a decision on the follow-on to Mercury, which was Apollo. Even in those days, it was called Apollo. But he did agree to go ahead with the development of the larger booster, the Saturn. And then about, I would guess, offhand, maybe 3 or 4 weeks later, cosmonaut Gagarin orbited the Earth. And at that point, President Kennedy realized that there was an immediate policy issue. A paper was put together that outlined a manned program to the moon and said that McNamara and Webb felt that that was the right goal to take, that it was an achievable goal.
On May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard became America's first man in space. The flight was embarrassingly brief in duration, simply a ballistic lob to an altitude of 116 miles and a water landing barely 300 miles downrange. But the emotional impact was enormous. The United States allowed the world to watch, something the Soviets would never have dared. We were in the race, and exactly 20 days later, John Kennedy named the finish line.
I flee to the Earth.
It was an awesome, perhaps even impossible goal, for nobody had yet seriously considered the question of exactly how to land a vehicle on the moon, or more important, get it off again.
When the original idea of going to the moon was conceived, NASA hadn't really pinned down exactly how they were going to go to the moon. The lunar orbit rendezvous approach was an alternative. I think it was a pretty ingenious alternative. The person who is credited with having come up with the original idea is John Houbolt at NASA, and it seemed like a pretty attractive idea to us. So in the final analysis, the lunar orbit rendezvous approach was selected because it was more economical. Specifically, the command module could be specialized for re-entry, which was a very demanding environment and requires a hard, compact, heat-resistant vehicle in order to survive, aerodynamically shaped. In contrast, the lunar module was able to be specialized for operations in space and on the moon, where it has no aerodynamics to contend with and very little in the way of forces, either gravity or anything else.
The request for bid on the lunar module was unique in my
experience in that it did not ask for a specific design. It was almost like a game of 20 questions. You answer these questions, and if we think you know what you're talking about, we'll talk to you later. And consequently, we tried to do that. Now, to answer the questions, we had to postulate a design. And that really is what was shown in that little wood model that sits up there on the shelf. We thought that, in effect, when we finally did receive indication that we were the winners, that we would develop that design. But it turned out that no, we had just passed the entrance examination and that we would have to work with what is now the Johnson Center to develop a design. So in effect, the preliminary design of the lunar module started from scratch after the award.
That development work began in November 1962 when it was announced that Grumman had won the LEM competition. It wasn't the first time Grumman had been on the leading edge.
The best analogy to the problem of designing a spacecraft that seemed to be a fighter airplane. We didn't know anything about space any more than most people did at that time, but we did know a lot about producing reliable flying machines that had to operate in a very hostile and demanding environment. If you think about the skills that we had available from the aircraft design world, were really very directly applicable to the design of the lunar module. But everything else was a very logical extension of the aircraft designer's desire to go higher, faster, and farther.
At regular intervals during the design of the lunar module, Grumman built full-size models of the machine. With these mock-ups, engineers could check the fit of systems, astronauts could practice their procedures, and NASA could evaluate Grumman's progress.
NASA would come with literally hundreds of people. They would include all the astronauts and all the leaders of the various NASA centers and their supporting cast of engineers and experts. Now, in the case of the LEM, the crew had a lot of contact with the LEM besides just flying it from inside the crew compartment. It also served as their home base when it was on the moon, and the descent stage housed all the scientific equipment. All of those aspects of the LEM that the crew would actually use had to be evaluated in the mock-ups.
We had a sling with like a big bungee that ran down from the ceiling, and what the astronaut would do would hook it onto his suit, and he would go up the ladder, ingress and egress out of the LEM. And it was quite interesting, and if you ever got on one of those things, it was quite a thrill. It's like jumping off of a tree into water and then bouncing back up again.
The design of the landing gear is an interesting story in itself. Now, this was influenced by a couple of factors. It was influenced by the theories as to what the lunar surface might consist of. They varied all the way from a very light, powdery dust into which the whole LEM might sink. That was one extreme. The other extreme was that it was going to be ice, very slippery, very hard in some areas.
On a 250,000-mile trip, weight was critical. As the design developed from concept to hardware, the shape and structure changed in several significant ways.
When you compare these two models, the proposal model and the final version of the LEM, many of the differences that you see are the result of our desire to save weight on the lunar module. This proposal model had aircraft-style seats. We realized that we really didn't need seats in 0G or even 16G. So in this LEM and in the real LEMs, the crew was in a stand-up position. So what we were able to do, since the crew was standing up, we were able to design it such that the window was very close to the crew's eye. And that basically cut down the glass area drastically.
While the vehicle was being built in Bethpage, Grumman had to test the LEM's engines as well. The fuel was far too dangerous to mix or store anywhere short of a desert. And a desert was where Grumman went, to White Sands, New Mexico.
And a spear point operation, which White Sands was, because it came so far in advance of the operations at the Cape. Initially, we had to find out whether this descent engine could be fired, gimbaled, throttled, And would it in fact fire as long as this descent mission lasted? And we had an altitude chamber for the descent stage, and we had an altitude chamber for the ascent stage. The ascent stage was far more critical in the mission than the descent stage because it had no backup. And if there was anything that had to be absolutely perfect in the lunar module, it was the ascent engine. Because if you pressed the button to go back out into orbit around the moon and it didn't fire, the astronauts were lost.
In 3 wars, Grumman airplanes built a reputation for bringing their crews back alive. The LEM would too. Each LEM would be used just once, but Grumman built them to last.
The actual building was done in a very handcrafted, customized fashion. And in many, many cases, you were strictly relying on the integrity of that particular workman, because after he put something together, it was very, very difficult to tell whether it had been done properly or not. Consequently, when the LEM was in the factory, you could hardly see it. It was surrounded by scaffolding and protective covers of all types, both externally and inside the crew compartment.
We also had a rotate and clean machine, which they also called a tumbler. And what that did was, I think we had 3 cycles of tumbling. And it took all of the debris and dust and rivet tails and what have you, and we would catch it and weigh it on a big canvas sheet. And as you progressed along better and everybody got more used to working with this type of environment, the ships became much cleaner.
Here on Earth, the LEM was out of its element. Amid the bustle of a factory, the LEM was fragile, delicate. In fact, its outermost skin was a high-tech version of what people used to call tinfoil.
On the surface of the moon, you went from like plus 250 degrees Fahrenheit in the sunlight to minus 250 in the shade. And that happened fairly abruptly.
What happens when a potato wrapped in aluminum foil goes under 250 degrees Fahrenheit? It cooks. These astronauts would cook just like the potato would.
Engineers were combating yet another hazard of spaceflight.
In space, you're facing the sun, it's 240 degrees. The dark side is 240 degrees below zero. You have to insulate the spacecraft as well as possible because there's huge fuel tanks in there. And the fuel's going to boil at 100 degrees and freeze at 30 degrees.
Such a huge temperature variation could also cause the craft to buckle. Yet Grumman couldn't afford heavy heat shields.
Fortunately, for the space program, DuPont had developed this new material. It was aluminized mylar. It was a gold color, and they found if you built it up to perhaps 25 layers, it's an excellent insulator.
The LEM was coated in mylar. To many engineers, the final vehicle was an insult to every notion of what a spacecraft should look like.
Engineers, the final vehicle was an insult to every notion of what a spacecraft should look like.
But in the vacuum of space, it didn't need to be streamlined. It was one of the weirdest and most improbable flying machines ever conceived.
We are told this material blocks them from all forms of radiation they would find on the moon. Here's a video showing aluminum foil's effect on radiation.
Hello. We were watching the news tonight about the Japanese nuclear disaster, and we saw people in the streets of Japan carrying large sheets of cardboard over their heads with looked like tinfoil on top of them, and it looked to me like they were trying to prevent radiation from getting to them. And I was wondering, does that actually work? So I actually happen to have a sample of uranium here and a Geiger counter and some materials to show how much they deaden the, or how much they impede the radiation coming off of a sample of uranium. So let's take a look. So here is our, let's get a calibration on our Geiger counter, and I think it's ready. And there you can hear the ambient level of radiation just here, and we'll put it over the sample, and you can hear how much radiation it's getting when it's just held a few inches from our sample. So first of all, let's just try as a control. Well, we'll just try this tin foil first, and this is 16 layers of tin foil folded up. That doesn't do anything, as far as I can tell. Really not a very significant reduction in radiation at all. Now we take a larger, a more substantial piece of metal. Here's a double layered cookie sheet. Now that does quite a bit. There is without it. It slows it down quite a bit. I would guess maybe 20% of the, we're blocking like 80% of the radiation. But that's a pretty thick piece of metal. You can't just put a few layers of tin foil. As a control, let's see if just a folded up paper towel does. Pretty much nothing. So that's what you expect if you're just held a piece of cardboard above your head. But then I soak the paper towel in water. That actually stops it quite a bit too. Right. There it's going without it. Slows it down quite a bit. So if you get a bunch of wet paper towels or put a bunch of wet cloth on top of a cardboard board, it's going to do better than sheets of tin foil. Alright, thanks a lot, bye.
This video shows that the amount of protection put on the lunar module was not enough. It's also impressive that this guy found a better way of blocking radiation than NASA did the entire time they were brainstorming for the project. In the NASA article Radioactive Moon from 2005, it states, "On the moon, many of the things that can kill you are invisible. Breathtaking vacuum, extreme temperatures, and space radiation top the list. The surface of the moon is badly exposed to cosmic rays and solar flares, and some of that radiation is very hard to stop with shielding. Furthermore, when cosmic rays hit the ground, they produce a dangerous spray of secondary particles right at your feet. All this radiation penetrating human flesh can damage DNA, boosting the risk of cancer and other maladies. We are told in mainstream science that we are protected by Earth's magnetic field and don't have to worry about this radiation." In an article by Space.com it states, "The moon has no atmosphere and a very weak magnetic field. Astronauts living there would have to provide their own protection, for example by burying their habitat underground. None of the Apollo 11 astronauts would receive any abnormalities from the radiation." Here's the last part I want to include about radiation. It's a presentation by NASA's own Jeffrey Rusick.
The other big challenge we have is just radiation in space. There's a field of radiation out there, high energy ions, electrons, all kinds of charged particles, and they're just everywhere. And this is showing the magnetic protection that the Earth provides to these particles. So we're sitting here on Earth, and we have this protection system around us, and the particles can't get to us because, and then we're effectively shielded from that. So the problem is when we go out into deep space, these particles are everywhere, and there's a tremendous number of them, and we have they affect our electronics and they affect us. So one of the biggest problems we have is what's the effect on us as we travel to deep space, and how do we protect ourselves? So I wanted to put this in when the Mars Science Laboratory traveled to Mars last year and landed last year. The last couple of bars on this chart are radiation dose. Okay, they measured radiation dose on the way to Mars, and it took them about 6 months. And then there's the red bar on there is the 500 days on Mars. So if you take the bars that show, if it takes you 6 months to get to Mars, and you spend 500 days on Mars, and then you spend 180 more days coming back, if you add up just those last 2 bars on that curve, in that curve there, you end up with a dose that is deadly to, that's not healthy for humans. I wouldn't say deadly, but bad, not good news. Because you could see the comparisons here for the other things, so this space station and things like that. So we need to solve that problem. We need to solve how we protect ourselves if we're going to do these missions to Mars and other places in deep space. And we do not have the answer for this yet. This is one of the things we just don't have the answer. And we also haven't demonstrated the power capability that we need out there to live and survive in deep space, to have the habitation. Because like I said, you need 15 to 30 kilowatts. That's why the station has 100 kilowatts on it, because you use about 25 all the time. And if you're sitting on the station, you want to have that backup. I mean, you want another 25 and another 25 and another 25, because you just saw they had that pump problem on station, and they lost some of their cooling on half of the station. So you want to have that other half of the station still running, and then you're cooling it so that you have that redundancy. So you need the same kind of thing that we have on the station out in deep space. So what I wanted to leave you with is we need to figure out how we're going to accomplish these deep space missions as a nation, as NASA and as a nation, and you folks out there. It's not going to be in my generation. It's not going to happen from what I see. So the way to solve the radiation problem is we need shorter exposure time, really, and we need shielding. Okay. Now there are ways to get shorter exposure time, which is you travel faster. But how do you travel faster? And we're having, you can use chemical, but then how do you replenish when you get out there and so forth? So it's very difficult to do. So there's nuclear thermal, and then there's ion engines and things like that. But it turns out, from what we've looked at, that the ion engines just don't provide the kind of impulse we need to get out there in a hurry. Because we'd like to shorten the time to Mars to 30 days or so, like 6 times faster. And we don't know we don't have the systems in place to do that today. So the main thing we need to do is we need to demonstrate something that gives us that capability as we move forward here. That's the dream, that we just keep moving forward and keep pushing out. So how do we do that? And right now, there's nothing on the books that says, here, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to get there. So the other thing, the radiation challenge is such a big challenge for us, we don't know what to do with it. We have a website that's been set up, and it's the NASA Exploration Design Challenge for Radiation. And they're asking all of you at this website, they're asking all of you to participate. And it goes through K through 12. K through 12, college students, whoever's out there, NASA, and we're all looking for ideas for how we solve that problem for deep space exploration. How do we protect ourselves? How do we shield ourselves? What are the mechanisms? What are the new ideas that could come our way where we could do that? So we need that data, we need that information from whoever's got it, any new ideas people have. And then we're going to go ahead and, well, won't be me, but we'll go ahead and implement those ideas in the future. So that's what I want to leave you with is we have major challenges to keep our dream alive of exploring deep space. And radiation and power, we need to come up with some demonstrations and do those demonstrations in the next couple of decades so that we can keep pursuing our dreams out in deep space.
The strategy, the design strategy that we used was to wrap the lunar module in insulation so that it would be basically thermally isolated from its surroundings. Now that insulation was Mylar. It was an aluminized Mylar. The Mylar itself was kind of a gold color, and it's very prominent in any of the pictures of the LEM that you see.
The only way pilots could practice maneuvering and landing the LEM was with flight simulators and awkward lunar lander rigs. Never before had a flying machine gone into actual service without a single test flight. But for the LEM, there was no other way. No other way, that is, than to test every system separately and together on the ground, every step of the way.
We tested at the component level, we tested at the assembly level, we tested at the subsystem level, and of course we finally tested at the all-up level. And statistically, you couldn't prove reliability.
The American space engineers and scientists designed the lunar module for the most delicate part of this or any mission, setting men down safely on another planet. The lunar landing craft really is one of the strangest flying machines ever designed. Certainly it's one of the funniest looking machines, but it gets the job done. It's just under 23 feet tall, and it is beautifully constructed for its purpose, to land softly on the moon, a place with no atmosphere and only 1/6 of the Earth's gravity. This is how the Grumman engineers and designers answered the question, how do you build a lunar module? Something to get you to the moon, something to get you from the moon. To the descent stage, you add an engine, fuel and oxidizer tanks to make that engine work. And when the spider-like legs necessary for a lunar landing are added, you have 11 feet of descent stage, the something to get you to the moon. The ascent stage has other requirements, room for 2 astronauts, and the means to control their environment. An engine with which to leave the moon, fuel for that engine, and an electrical power supply. A docking tunnel hatch to enable the crew to get to and from the command module, and a hatch to get to the surface of the moon. On the outside, reaction control engines to maneuver with. Radar, so that the ascent stage can rendezvous with the command module. Communications antenna for contact with that command module and with Houston. Put all of that together, and you've designed something to get you to the moon and something to get you from the moon, a LEM.
Just over 4 years to go before Kennedy's deadline, the Grumman facility on Long Island began rolling out the first full-scale lunar modules. For some years, astronauts had been training on a simulator known as the Flying Bedstead.
It's basically a jet engine in the middle, little rocket engines all around it on the outside, just like the lunar module, and astronauts sat in a little capsule in the front, and they would take off vertically and hover and try to simulate landing on the moon.
It was unstable and dangerous, and the astronauts hated it.
Neil Armstrong had to eject out of it right before it crashed. At some point in the program, they actually stopped using it because it was a lot safer to land on the moon than it was to fly this machine down in Texas.
We now realize that the lunar module is a piece of junk, so we'll talk about the service module and the command module. They're often referred to as the command service module.
The module, together with its power unit and main engine, which sits underneath it down there, is what's generally referred to as the mother spacecraft. And on this flight, it'll be the base of operations from which the lunar module goes down to the surface of the moon and back up. It's really quite small. At its widest point across the base, it's only about 13 feet. It's made of honeycomb aluminium and steel on the outside, and the top comes off, as it is here, in order to let the crew go up through into the lunar module. There are 2 windows on either side through which they take most of the camera shots, and then 2 rendezvous windows here and here with the glass slanted this way so that the crew can see through in the direction in which they're generally going, forwards that way. The hatchway here is opened only twice, once to get in on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy and once more to get out in the Pacific when they get back. Inside, it's even more cramped than it looks from outside, for 3 men, all of whom are about 5'11" each. The lunar module pilot, Buzz Aldrin, lies in that couch there. In the center couch, which has been taken out to let us get in, Michael Collins, the command module pilot, and Neil Armstrong, the man who will be the first to set foot on the moon, the commander, flies in the left-hand couch here. Now, the commander's instrument panel obviously contains the most important flight instruments on board because he's the man who flies the spacecraft most of the way. And he flies it essentially by putting it in the right position in space using these directional jet controllers here on his hand grips. Once he's got the spaceship in the right position in space, he then uses the controls on his main instrument panel to fire the engine in the direction he's set himself to go. First of all, of course, the computer, which gives him all the information he needs to make the decisions he has to. Down here, the whole section that covers what he has to do if something goes wrong on launch, the abort panel, as it's called. Next to the abort panel, the fuel stage of the 3rd stage, that's the stage that fires them from Earth orbit out towards the moon. Right above that, the attitude indicator, that's the control that tells him which way he's facing in space. Over here, the command module pilot, but his normal area of work, because he's the navigator, is down here. This is where the navigator, that's the command module pilot, spends most of his time, in the navigation bay. He has, of course, up there on his panel, also instruments that he has to check all the way through the flight, basically instruments that tell him the fuel states of the engines on board. But here's where he spends most of his time. And he spends most of his time looking through a sextant and a telescope up here. You navigate in space using those instruments like this. You line up the instruments on a star, and when you've lined that up, you press the button and that information goes into the computer. And the computer then says, yes, I agree, that star is where it ought to be, therefore we're on course. It's useful that the computer can check that, because on Apollo 8, they once lined up the instruments on a blob of urine that was floating not too far away in space, and the computer said, don't be worried, we're not in the wrong place, that's not a star, that's a blob of urine. This is the only part of the spacecraft that you can actually stand up in, because it leads to the docking tunnel through to the lunar module, and being able to stand up in a spacecraft really pleases most astronauts.
The engineers at North American soon realized that the Apollo spacecraft would be far more complex than anything they had built before.
When you break it down by functions, by what you have to do step by step, then you see what you actually have to do. You needed a propulsion system. You needed an environmental control system.
Oxygen and water.
The food supply.
You needed a heat shield.
A parachute to bring them back to Earth.
Human waste disposal.
You had shaving supplies, you had hygiene.
A window to look out of.
We also had to look out for micrometeorites.
They had life preservers, they had a couple machetes.
The command module was a little tiny house for 3 people.
North American started by building wooden mock-ups to get a feel for the layout of the new 3-man spacecraft.
Getting 3 people to live in that little house for 14 or 15 days became a pretty difficult project.
The engineers were faced with a dilemma. A spacecraft large enough to sustain 3 men all the way to the moon would be too big to safely return to Earth.
If you put everything you need inside the command module itself, it becomes quite large and heavy. And when you plan to re-enter back into the Earth's atmosphere, a large, heavy vehicle is not desirable.
The heavier a spacecraft, the more energy it has when it hits the Earth's atmosphere, and therefore the more heat it will generate as it slows down. A fully laden Apollo spacecraft would simply burn up. But North American realized that not everything that went to the moon needed to come back to Earth. The answer was to split the Apollo spacecraft in two.
So the solution to the problem wound up having essentially a two-module concept, the service module and the command module. The service module was like a trailer behind the command module, and it was attached to the command module during launch, stayed attached all the way through the trip to the moon, on the way back, and just before re-entry, the service module would be jettisoned.
The service module would carry almost everything the crew would need to keep them alive for the duration of the mission.
It has the propulsion system, it has the fuel cells for the power, it has the oxygen and hydrogen tanks that are the reactants for the fuel cells, and it's got, of course, the engine.
With much of the weight of the spacecraft in the service module, the Apollo capsule would now be small and light enough to survive re-entry. But there wouldn't be much space for the three-man crew to live for 10 days.
If you look at it very simply, it's about a 6 by 6 by 6 cube. That's what you're living in.
During training, getting into and out of the command module was always a slow and difficult business. It didn't seem to matter at the time, but the consequences of this simple fact would bring America's race to the moon to a shocking halt. While one set of engineers were grappling with what went on inside the command module, another team at North American were working on the outside. Would it be tough enough to survive the rigors of a flight to the moon and the return to Earth? It was time for the capsule's first flight. The drop tests demonstrated how dangerous a hard landing could be for the astronauts. A water landing seemed like a better bet. But a splashdown came with its own problems, as the first test revealed.
Water landings were conducted in a slightly different way. We had something that would be very similar to a child's swing. And in place of the child, we would have the Apollo spacecraft.
This was that big tower there in Downey, and we swung the command module, splashed down, and we were all so happy seeing it there floating, and suddenly we saw that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It was sinking. I remember that was one of the darkest days that we had in the beginning.
The capsule's belly flop had cracked its outer skin, allowing water to flood in. It was hugely embarrassing for the engineers.
Remember, this isn't very far down, and the astronauts went a heck of a lot farther.
We were devastated. I was specifically devastated because this could lead to a delay in the total Apollo program.
What terrified everybody was a repeat performance of Gus Grissom's near drowning when his Mercury capsule had sunk after splashdown. The thought of 3 men returning safely from the moon only to drown in front of the world's press was unbearable. So the command module's new, stronger outer shell was exposed to some of the most rigorous testing of the whole Apollo program.
The instrumentation included cameras underwater, cameras external, cameras to record the conditions. It was a test program that was to truly verify that we would have a successful landing.
The water tests proved that the command module could survive splashdown. But what about liftoff? During launch, the spacecraft would be sitting on top of the Saturn V booster, filled with over 3,000 tons of highly explosive fuel. So the engineers designed a sort of ejector seat for the whole command module in case anything went wrong.
The launch escape tower was a rocket at the front of the command module that would pull the command module away from the booster if there were a problem with the booster.
The system would be triggered by 3 wires that ran down the entire length of the Saturn V booster.
If we would lose power on 2 out of 3 wires, that signified that the booster is falling apart, and we would just get off.
In November 1965, the North American engineering team gathered to witness another make-or-break test. A rocket called Little Joe was to be used to test the launch escape system.
The idea was to launch it up to about 10,000 feet, then fire the escape rocket to pull the command module away from the other device.
1, fire.
This time, they had made a little mistake in how they hooked up the roll gyros. And the vehicle started to roll. When it broke the link on the escape rocket. The escape rocket fired, pulled the command module right off the top. And it was a perfectly successful flight, very well instrumented flight, gave us all the data we needed about the launch escape system, but the vehicle had failed in the process.
Ironically, the unanticipated failure of the Little Joe rocket provided the best possible test for the escape system, and it had performed perfectly. But as the engineers celebrated, events were about to take a tragic turn, one which would throw into question every aspect of their new spacecraft. January 1967, and the new Apollo spacecraft was going through its final tests before its maiden manned flight into space.
Apollo 1 was going to be our first true Earth orbital test of the vehicle. It was really to understand the interface with the astronauts and the spacecraft. So it's really what you would call a shakedown mission prior to leaving the gravitational field of the Earth.
The command module was an early design known as a Block 1. As with any prototype, it had its teething problems. But the flaws with this spacecraft were more serious.
The Block 1 vehicle was not lunar capable, and because of the pressure schedule, I think there were things that were not done quite perfectly in it.
We didn't really have the kind of focus, I thought, in retrospect, that we should have had.
So we had a lot of problems in the qualification testing of the hardware throughout the system. And they were not a good foundation of confidence to go to the moon.
Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee would all lose their lives in the Apollo 1 fire. Some would say it was sabotage, including the Grissom family. Grissom was often an outspoken critic of NASA, including right before he lost his life.
The problems began almost immediately. First, the capsule's communication systems failed.
You copy? No, I didn't read you, Chuck, at all. I can't read you, Chuck. You want to try the phone? How do you get the moon? We can't pass between 3 buildings. I can't hear a thing you're saying.
Suddenly, the capsule burst into flames with the astronauts sealed inside.
The environment in the cabin at the time was 100% oxygen at 16 pounds per square inch.
Such high levels of oxygen had been pumped into the command module to help seal the inward opening hatch against the outside air pressure. But no one had considered the possible consequences of an atmosphere of 16 pounds per square inch of pure oxygen.
The crew was going through their test. There's a test procedure that you go through. You activate all the systems. You basically activate every system you have in the vehicle and down to 0, but you don't ignite the engine.
At 6:30 p.m., with the simulations dragging on into the evening, a glitch in the capsule's electrical systems was detected by launch control.
Somehow we got a spark. We don't know how that spark occurred, but there was a spark. And at 16 psi, everything burns. Aluminum burns. All the insulation on the wires burn. All the wiring burned.
And with an inward opening hatch, the astronauts could not open the hatch.
And the crew perished because of that.
One by one, wherever they were around the country, the engineers heard the news.
And a highway patrolman stopped and said, "Is there Mike Vucelich in the car?" I said, "Yes, it is me." He said, "You call your control center." I said, "What's the problem?" He said, I can't tell you."
By the next day, many of the North American engineers had reached the Cape to see for themselves what had gone so badly wrong.
They had gotten to the place where they had the hatch open by the time I got there. And it was a disaster. We didn't have much to say, neither NASA or us at the time.
That was a very hard time for me. I almost felt responsible because I was the guy that was associated with the oxygen and the like.
It was very, very difficult situation, and I felt responsible in some ways. All of us were shocked with how easily things burnt in oxygen, high pressure oxygen.
This proved that the capsule wasn't ready, 2 years before we're on the moon. In fact, none of the 3 major pieces would be tested properly. NASA continues to state that they wanted to test things as they went, as a sense of urgency was on the rise. The astronauts for the Apollo mission would be Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. I will go into detail about each one in further videos. Neil would drive the command service module to the moon, and then once they got there, switch with Michael Collins to have him orbit around the moon, while Neil and Buzz descend in the LM. They would allege to land in the Sea of Tranquility. Although we were shown a successful landing, things began to look suspicious upon further investigation. For example, there would be no blast crater, despite all previous artist depictions having one.
The fact that there's no blast crater under the LEM is one of the most conclusive pieces of evidence that I find supporting the hoax.
In fact, no sign of a blast crater is visible for any of the 6 lunar landings. But LEM specialist Paul Fiel says he can explain why the lunar module left no crater when landing on the moon.
The amount of thrust that you need coming out of the bottom of the descent engine is about 1,500, 2,000 pounds of thrust. And all that does is just push dust away. There's no burning or anything like that.
Okay, so he just said it's about 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of thrust. I'm going to show you a couple of videos with less pounds of thrust, and I want you to think about if it would leave a crater or not on the surface of something with less gravity, as they say. And finally, this is the actual rocket test from Grumman. This amount of thrust would clearly disrupt the moon's surface.
NASA's own scientific illustrations clearly depict a blast crater.
Then there's one other point. If they had truly landed on the moon, this dust would have then descended on the lunar lander, on the foot pads, and we find not a trace of dust on the foot pads. When I discovered that alone, I said, no way am I looking at a lunar lander that landed on the moon.
Could it be that the LEM was just a prop on a giant lunar movie set?
That's exactly what it was. A prop on a giant movie set. T. Keith Glennon would be the first administrator for NASA. He would also go on to be a studio manager of Paramount Pictures in Samuel Goldwyn Studios. Let's go over the Apollo cinematic tricks. The most appalling trick they used was on the way to the moon, and this footage was uncovered by Bart Sabrell.
In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass, and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with, "Talk." Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. We're mapping in on Earth.
Again, the illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private. Until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil, we just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from entering through the other windows. Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form 2 different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue cast. See white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away? Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway.
According to David Percy, an award-winning filmmaker and photographer, the proof is in NASA's own lunar photos and video.
Our research suggests that images of the Apollo landings are not a true and accurate record. In our view, the Apollo pictures were faked. Many of the images are replete with inconsistencies and anomalies.
In fact, Percy claims that when examined, these images suggest that man never went to the moon at all. This famous scene of man taking his first steps on the lunar surface is one of the most recognizable in history. But why are such important images so grainy and hard to see?
And we're getting a picture on the TV. You got a good picture, huh?
NASA claims it's the result of 1960s technology.
If you go back and look at it, the Apollo 11 mission was some pretty awful video by today's standards. These were ghostly images. It just did not look very real at all. And that was a function of the transmitter at the time, the camera at the time that we had available to us to fly on Apollo 11.
But investigative journalist Bart Sabrell believes that NASA intentionally made the images hard to see.
NASA orchestrated the hoax in a very unique way through television. They had one picture which they completely controlled, black and white, grainy, that convinced everybody we were on the moon. We had no reason to doubt it. They had complete reins over the pictures, over the sound. I mean, sad to say, it was easier than people believe.
But despite the lack of clarity, conspiracy theorists see evidence suggesting that these images were staged.
It's absolutely unreal.
Although it appears that the astronauts are moving in the moon's gravity, which is 1/6 that of the Earth, Percy notes that when the speed of the film is doubled, the astronauts appear to be running as if in Earth's gravity.
This was a major mess up in the Apollo 11 movie. They couldn't get this right. You see, the spacesuit itself would be 200 pounds. Neil and Buzz Armstrong were about 160 apiece. That'd be 360 each. Since the moon has 1/6 gravity, as they tell us, you would only be about 60 pounds. You could jump higher than you've ever jumped before, yet these guys can barely jump at all. These men would allegedly be on the moon for 22 hours before returning to the lunar module, waiting to pop back up and dock with Michael Collins. Supposedly going home to be the first men on the moon. These men would be heroes everywhere they went for the lies that they gave. Thanks everyone for watching part 2. This is Matt from Mankind.
It was, in fact, in our view, preferable both to weightlessness and the Earth's gravity.